class, in this video we are talking about research. So we're going to talk about different types of psychological research and why it's important to do it. First thing to talk about is why research is important and the process that we use for research. When we talk about this, if you remember from chapter 1, we use the empirical method to do this. The scientific knowledge is empirical. It's based on objective, tangible evidence. It can be observed again and again. It's not just assumptions. It's not just opinions. Research is what differentiates facts from opinions. So facts are observable realities. Opinions are personal judgments. The research you're learning about in this class this semester, it's based on facts. It's not just the opinion of the researchers or me as your professor. The scientific process is also circular. You have ideas that are tested against the real world, and then these observations are going to lead to more ideas that are going to be tested, which will then lead to more ideas that you then have to test. So you don't just do one experiment and then that's the end of it. It leads to more experiments down the road. When you're doing research, there's two types of reasoning you can use, deductive or inductive. Deductive reasoning is when ideas are tested against the empirical world, and it begins with a generalization. So you have a hypothesis, and then that is used to reach a logical conclusion about the world. If the hypothesis is correct, then the conclusion that you reach will be correct. So when we think about deductive reasoning, this is things like if-then statements. If this is true, then that must be true as well. You also have inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is when empirical observations lead to new ideas. So you use these empirical observations to construct broad generalizations. The conclusions that come from this inductive reasoning may or may not be correct, regardless of the observations they're based on. They tend to be less accurate, potentially, than the inductive reasoning answers. So, for example, if my kids say, my mom has earrings, so all moms must have earrings. That would be inductive. I'm going to make this broad generalization because of this one observation. Not necessarily true. You also need to know the difference between theories, hypotheses, and making sure a hypothesis is falsible. So, first, theory. A theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena. So researchers create hypotheses to test specific aspects of the theory, but usually a theory is not going to get to the point where it is in like your textbook unless it has been tested a lot. So theories are not just assumptions. Theories have work put into them. They have been tested. A hypothesis is a testable prediction about how the world will behave if your idea is correct. Oftentimes, a hypothesis is phrased as an if-then statement. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be if-then. But oftentimes, if this is true, then that will be true. If you have this scenario, then this is what's going to happen. For example, one experiment that I did that I'll talk about this chapter is taking the perspective of someone who hurt you in order to forgive them more, generally speaking. And so a couple ways to phrase my hypothesis would be, if you're doing it as an if-then statement, if you take the perspective of someone who hurt you, then you'll be able to have more forgiveness for them. That's my hypothesis. A way you tend to see hypotheses phrased that you are going to use for an experiment is more assertive, and then you're proving your hypothesis correct or null. And so to phrase it that way, it would be perspective taking has an effect on forgiveness levels. A little more broad, but it's saying this is what I think is true. And then you go and test it and see if that hypothesis is true or not. So when you make a hypothesis, it has to be falsible, which means you have to be able to prove that it's incorrect. With my hypothesis, perspective taking has an effect on unforgiveness or forgiveness levels. I'm a pessimist. I study unforgiveness. You can test that. I can manipulate perspective taking and see what it does to unforgiveness levels. I can prove my hypothesis true or false. So you have to have a falsible hypothesis, something that you can prove is accurate or not. One researcher you learned about last chapter, Freud, one big complaint with him is that he did not make hypotheses that were falsible. You could not prove it true or not, true or false. And so that's one of the biggest complaints about Freud is how do you test his research? You can't really test a lot of what he talked about. Oops, hold on one second. Okay, I had to fix that word there. So what we're doing this chapter, the main focus of this chapter, we are going to be talking about ways to do research. We're going to talk about approaches to research. I'm going to briefly mention the three main ones, and then we're going to break these down into a lot more detail. If you use observational techniques in your research, you're going to observe people. You're going to watch them. It can be more than people. It can be, monkeys, dogs, whatever. You watch them to see what happens. The good thing about this is that it can produce a lot of information. A downside is that it's difficult to say if you observe it in this situation, then you can apply that to a larger population. Just because you observed it in this situation, you can't necessarily say everyone is always going to act like that. So that's one potential downside. Another potential downside is that if all you're doing is an observation, you can't say cause and effect. You cannot say what I observe here is causing this other thing to happen. You cannot assume causation just from an observation. Another main area of research we'll talk about is interviews or surveys. A good thing about this is that it's really easy to collect large amount of information. It's fairly easy to collect a large sample to give a survey to a bunch of people, especially now there's a lot of online options like Amazon Turk, SurveyMonkey, that sort of thing. And that can help you generalize the information to a larger population because you've talked to a lot more people. But a couple of limitations with interviews is that it's self-reported data. And so there's a couple of problems with the self-reported data. One is who is choosing to report, who is choosing to say, yes, I want to participate in the survey. So you kind of get this self-selected group of people potentially if you don't do things to try to mitigate that. The other problem with this, with it being self-report, is that sometimes people lie. If you're doing, like for example, if you're doing an experiment at McDaniel about illicit drug use among students, how many students are going to be like, yes, I am totally using lots of drugs in my dorm room all the time? You're going to get people who lie because they don't want to get in trouble. And so that's another potential problem with interviews and surveys. Also, just like with observations, if all you're doing is a survey, you can't claim cause and effect. You can't say this thing caused that thing to happen if all you've done is interview people about it. And then another big way to do research is experiments. An experiment is usually conducted in like a lab setting. Not so often is it done out in the real world, but potentially can be. One problem with that is just because this is the way people act in a lab, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the way they would act in a real world situation. So you need to be aware of that. But in an experiment in general, and again, we'll go into this in more detail later, you are going to manipulate one variable to see how that affects another variable. Again, for example, the example I will use is my perspective taking and forgiveness experiment. I manipulated whether or not people took the perspective of the other person, and then I looked to see what effect that had on their unforgiveness levels. The good thing about experiments, this is the one thing where you can claim cause and effect. This thing caused that thing to happen. Next type is case studies. So for case studies, this is sometimes called clinical studies as well. This is when you look in depth at one person or a few people. For example, a few famous case studies. Jeannie, she was a girl who was raised in a basement and really isolated for like the first 12 years of her life. No one spoke to her, just horrible neglect. After they discovered her and saved her from this neglectful home, she became a case study in linguistic development. What happens if kids aren't exposed to language for the first 12 years of their life? Another case study is Krista and Tatiana Hogan. They are conjoined twins. They're joined at the head. They share a thalamus, which you'll learn about in chapter 3, what the thalamus does. And they have been studied their whole lives. You tend to get a lot of information about those people when they become a case study. But a downside of case studies is a lack of generalizability, which is when you can apply your findings to a larger population. So for example, another case study is Gabby Giffords, who was a congresswoman who was shot through the head at an event in her district about a decade ago. And she's a case study in brain damage. What happens when you have severe brain damage from a bullet? It hit her, most of the damage was in her the left hemisphere, left side of her brain, especially like the left frontal lobe. Language was affected, all that stuff. She can now speak again, very simple words. She's not going to give up and give a complex speech, but she can speak. Just because she was able to recover that much does not mean everyone who was shot in the same way would be at the same level a decade later. She was really young, she was healthy, she had the best medical care in the country that she could get. There are all these factors that she had that maybe other people wouldn't have. So just because she turned out this way does not mean everyone in that same situation will turn out that way. But you tend to use case studies when something unique happens, like getting shot through the head, like being kept in a basement for 12 years, like being a conjoined twin. When it comes to something horrible, like being shot or the child neglect, those things are not ethical to go do to people just to see what happens. You can't go shoot someone just to research them. But if it happens in the real world, then go research that person. Turn that person into a case study with their permission so that you can learn more about it. Another type, a version of observational research is naturalistic observation. Specific type is when you go out to the real world. You go to people in their natural environment and observe them. And to do that, an important thing is to be inconspicuous, to not try to stand out as much. So for example, I think your book talks about an experiment or an naturalistic observation that Susan Fanger did, where they were studying kids on the playground, and so they, were recording it from the side, but then they also had mics on the kids. They gave them wireless mics, and the kids forgot they were wearing the microphones, but then they could hear what the kids were saying as they're going and playing on the playground and observe their interactions. So it made it a little more inconspicuous. I did a naturalistic observation once in a barber shop, and I pretended to be the girlfriend of someone who was getting their hair cut. So I sat there with a magazine, with my notebook hidden in a magazine. So I was not, this really obvious person who was staring at people. They just thought I was a random person in the barbershop. So you've got to make sure that you are not affecting how people act because of your presence. A good thing about this is something we call ecological validity. So basically what that means is that there's realism. It's like the real world because you're actually in the real world. So it makes it easier to generalize what you see to other real world situations. The downside of this is it can be really hard to set up. It can be difficult to do a naturalistic observation. So other versions of this, you can do a structured observation, which is when you watch people while they do specific tasks. One type of structured naturalistic observation you are going to watch is something called the strange situation. And that was Mary Ainsworth who did that one, and you'll learn about this in the developmental chapter, but it's how you study attachment in little kids. And it's you are behind a two-way mirror watching these kids in a room with toys and their caregiver and a stranger, and the caregiver and the stranger come and go at certain intervals, and you watch how the kid reacts. So it's a more naturalistic observation because they don't realize they're being watched. They just think they're in a room with toys, but it's specific things. It's structured. Parent is there for 3 minutes. Stranger comes in for 2 minutes, that sort of thing. One thing to think about with observations is observer bias. You have to be careful about observer bias. Observer bias is when you have people who are the observers. They're closely involved in the research. They might unconsciously skew their observations to fit their hypothesis, their expectations for the research. And there's a big way to protect against this is to have more than one person do the observations. That can let you have inter-rater reliability. And inter-rater reliability is when it's a measure of reliability that looks at the consistency of observations by different observers. For example, I had a friend who was doing a naturalistic observation with kindergartners in a kindergarten classroom. She was interested in the effect that teachers' discussion of emotion words affected emotion regulation in kindergartners. So basically, how much did the little kids freak out or control their emotions based on how much their teachers talked about emotions? And so this was part of her dissertation for her PhD. Lots of ideas about this. She was a former kindergarten teacher herself. And so she was worried about this observer bias. So what she did was she hired me to go with her to these classrooms and make the observations. And at this point, I was like 25, 26. Didn't have kids, didn't care about kids, didn't care about emotion regulation in kids. And so I would go with her and do these observations. And then at the end, we'd compare our notes. Like, how did you see what this kid did? How much did you rate his emotional response? How many times did you hear the teacher talk about emotions? And if we saw the same things and gave them the same ratings, then there was a better chance that it was actually legit. It actually mattered. It wasn't just her bias. And next thing we are going to talk about is surveys, archival research, and longitudinal as well as cross-sectional research. And that, after we do this slide, this will be the last slide we cover for this video. We'll start in with correlations in the next video. So for surveys, like I briefly mentioned before, we're going to go into this a little bit more now. Surveys are a list of questions that you have your participants answer. There's a lot of ways to do this. It can be online, it can be verbal, an interview, it can be a paper and pencil questionnaire, lots of different ways to do surveys. And the good part about it, again, is that you can get a large sample. It's very affordable for researchers. It can be a really easy way to collect a large amount of data. When we are talking about surveys, you need to know the difference between the sample and the population. This isn't just for surveys, actually, for any type of research. The sample is the subset of people that are in your experiment or your survey. It's the people you actually interact with for your research. So who is actually a participant in your study? Your population is the overall group of individuals that researchers are interested in. And so for example, if I'm interested in doing a survey on illicit drug use at McDaniel, my sample is going to be the 50 students that I have fill out my questionnaire. And my population would be all McDaniel college students. Another example, actually, yes. Well, I'll give you another example that also shows a problem potentially with research. And that is, say for example, I just teach online right now for McDaniel since I live in Mexico. I am interested to know how much McDaniel students want to have the option of taking online classes. How much you still want to have some online options now that COVID has chilled some. And so my sample would be the students that fill out my survey saying, yes, I want online classes, no, I don't. My population would be all McDaniel students, again. But what you need to make sure is that your sample is what we call a representative sample. I think I can't remember if I talk about this later, because again, this is in more than just this type of research. But you want a representative sample. And what a representative sample means is that your sample looks like your population so that you can generalize to the population. If I want to be lazy and I just give my survey to my students, and that's who's in my study, then there's a good chance it's not going to be a representative sample, that it's not going to look like what the response would be from McDaniel students as a whole, because all my students have chosen to sign up for an online class. So probably they're more interested in online classes. I'm not going to have anyone in my study who doesn't at least have some interest in online classes, because all my students are online students for at least my class. And so you have to make sure that everyone in your population has an equal chance of being asked to be in your study. It doesn't mean everyone in the population has to actually be in the study, but they all have to have an equal chance of being asked to participate so that you can then apply it, generalize what you find to the larger population. So for archival research, this is when you go and look at existing records for your answers. You're going to go look at, birth records from the 1950s or high school graduation rates from, during 2020, whatever it is, you go find data that's already there. So it relies on past records, past data sets. You are not creating any new data yourself. It tends to then take less time to do this type of research than other types because you don't have to actually perform the research yourself. You're just going to find what's already been collected. One difficulty of archival research is you don't get to decide what they asked because you weren't the one that asked the questions. You're just finding the answers that are already there. So you can't guarantee consistency between records. Like, take, for example, if you're going to look at GPA rates. How do you know every single high school weighted things the same? Did they all use a 10-point scale, or was it a 7-point scale? Did they use A pluses, or did no one use A pluses? There's not necessarily consistency. That can be a problem when you're trying to combine all this into a big set of data. And then finally, longitudinal versus cross-sectional research. You need to know the difference between these two. Longitudinal research, you look at one group of people more than once. So you go back to them over a 3-month period or a 3-year period, or there's been some famous longitudinal studies. There's one at Harvard that a guy named Waldinger is the current person who is the director of this study. And it started back like in the, when did it start? 1930s? It's been going on almost 100 years. That's going to be a longitudinal study. You look at one group multiple times. There's a Wisconsin longitudinal study that's been going on since the 50s, where they looked at people who were graduating from Wisconsin high schools in 1957. And they went back to them several times, like in 1964, in 1975, in 92, in 2004, and it helps you see change over time. Downside of longitudinal studies, it takes a long time. If you want to see how someone changes between 20 and 50, you have to wait 30 years if you're going to do a longitudinal study. And that can also involve then a lot of financial investment. You also have to have people who are willing to stay in the study that long. So there's the risk of attrition. Attrition is a reduction in the number of participants because people drop out. For example, the Wisconsin study. The rate of people responding in any given year was anywhere between 48% and 92%, depending on what year it was and what group they were trying to reach. So downsides potentially for longitudinal studies. Cross-sectional studies are slightly different. Cross-sectional studies are when you look at different age groups at once. So those age groups, those generations, those are what cohorts are. So a cohort is a generation-specific age group. So if you're interested in people who are 20 and how they differ from people who are 40, you find a bunch of 20-year-olds and you find a bunch of 40-year-olds and you compare them at one time. You don't go back 20 years. The good part about this research, if doing a cross-sectional study, is it's fast. You can find your answers all at once. The downside is that sometimes how people respond can reflect social or cultural experiences that are based on when the person was born and not specific to that exact age group. For example, if you want to, what's an example? Take, for example, views on same-sex marriage. If you did a study, a survey, because you wanted to see how views on same-sex marriage change over time. Do people get more progressive, or do they get more conservative on their views on the legality of same-sex marriage? If you did that survey now, you wouldn't find a huge difference between people who are 20 and people who are 40. A significant percent of both groups are going to be fine with it because most Americans are fine with it. I remember I was teaching at a community college in North Carolina before same-sex marriage was legal federally. And North Carolina was voting on a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage in the state. And a lot of my students, because of their social and cultural experiences, were against same-sex marriage, even though they were 20, when you would assume they'd be more progressive. A lot of people who are 40 now, like my generation, who are totally fine with same-sex marriage, when they were 20, they weren't. And it's not because you get more progressive as you get older on this issue. It's that everyone in the country has gotten more progressive on this issue, almost. It's not an age thing, it's a culture thing. And so if you're doing cross-sectional research, you can miss some of that. What the differences you see, you might think it's because of age, but it could be other factors that are involved, other factors that are going into having people answer the way they do. So that's something to take into consideration. And that is it for this video.